I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who would be thrown out of her own daughter's life like yesterday's garbage. But here I am, 67 years old, sitting in my small apartment in Ohio, staring at the rain streaking down my window, wondering how everything went so wrong so fast. The apartment feels smaller today somehow. Maybe it's because I keep expecting my phone to ring with Sarah's voice on the other end, asking me to babysit Tommy or inviting me over for Sunday dinner. The silence is so thick I can almost taste it, bitter and heavy like the coffee I've been nursing since dawn. For 35 years, I was there for Sarah. Every scraped knee, every broken heart, every milestone that mattered. I remember teaching her to ride that pink bicycle on Maple Street, running behind her with my hand on the seat until she found her balance. I was there when she cried over Bobby Martinez breaking up with her before junior prom, holding her while she sobbed into my shoulder about how unfair life was. When she and David wanted to buy their first house, that little colonial with the white picket fence she'd dreamed about since she was 12, I helped with the down payment without hesitation. I was the grandmother who never missed a soccer game, rain or shine. I sat on those cold metal bleachers every Saturday morning, cheering for Tommy as he ran up and down the field in his oversized uniform. I never forgot a birthday, never showed up empty-handed to family gatherings. When Sarah needed someone to watch Tommy so she and David could have date nights, I was there with homemade cookies and bedtime stories. I thought that meant something. I thought 35 years of showing up, of being present, of putting their needs before my own, had built something unshakable between us. Until last Tuesday. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn golden when she called me, her voice tight with that familiar stress I'd heard so many times before. I was folding laundry in my tiny living room, watching the afternoon light filter through my discount store curtains, when my phone buzzed. "Mom, I need your help. Tommy needs a car for college, and we're a little short on the loan approval. Could you co-sign for us?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar anxiety creeping up my throat. At my age, with what everyone assumed was just my fixed income from Social Security and the small pension from my 30 years teaching at Lincoln Elementary, co-signing a loan wasn't just risky, it was potentially devastating. I'd seen too many seniors in my building lose everything because they couldn't say no to family members who saw them as walking ATMs. Mrs. Patterson down the hall had co-signed for her son's business loan 3 years ago. Now, she eats nothing but ramen noodles and generic cereal, and I sometimes hear her crying through the thin walls late at night. Mr. Rodriguez on the second floor lost his savings when his daughter defaulted on a car loan he'd guaranteed. He had to move in with relatives in Arizona, leaving behind the only community he'd known for 20 years. "Sarah, honey, I wish I could, but what, Mom? After everything we've done for you?" The accusation in her voice made my hands shake. Everything they'd done for me? What exactly had they done, besides allow me to be part of their lives, besides let me show up with casseroles and birthday presents and free babysitting? The conversation that followed still echoes in my mind, each word sharper than the last, her voice getting higher, more demanding, my own voice getting smaller, more apologetic, even though I knew I was being reasonable, even though I knew that protecting my financial security wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And now, as I watch the neighbors across the street hanging Halloween decorations, their children laughing as they rake leaves into piles to jump in, I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is about to unfold, something that will change everything between us forever. I just don't know yet that the terrible thing won't be what happens to me. It'll be what Sarah discovers about herself. The words still ring in my ears like a fire alarm that won't stop. Either help me or get out. I was standing in Sarah's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd taught her to make chocolate chip cookies when she was 8 years old, where we'd planned her wedding over countless cups of coffee and shared dreams. The morning sun was streaming through those yellow gingham curtains I'd helped her pick out at JCPenney 5 years ago, and suddenly everything felt foreign and cold, like I was standing in a stranger's house. The kitchen was pristine, as always. Sarah had inherited my need for order, but she'd taken it to levels I never could have afforded. Granite countertops that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months, stainless steel appliances that gleamed like mirrors, a kitchen island bigger than my entire dining area, topped with a bowl of perfect artificial fruit that no one was ever allowed to touch. "Sarah, please, let's talk about this calmly." "No, Mom, I'm tired of talking. Tommy needs this car. He got into state university, and he needs reliable transportation. We've been good to you. letting you be part of our lives, including you in everything. The least you could do is help us when we really need it, letting me be part of their lives. The phrase hit me like a slap across the face, as if my presence in their world was some kind of charity they'd been providing, as if the thousands of hours I'd spent babysitting, the countless dinners I'd cooked, the birthday parties I'd organized, the school events I'd attended, as if all of that was just me being graciously allowed to participate in their real family. My hands were shaking as I set down my coffee mug, the one that said, "World's Best Grandma," that Tommy had given me last Christmas. He'd been so proud when he presented it to me, wrapped in newspaper because he'd spent his allowance on the mug itself and couldn't afford proper wrapping paper. I'd treasured it, used it every morning since then. Now the irony wasn't lost on me. "Honey, I love you and Tommy more than life itself, but co-signing alone at my age, with my income. If something goes wrong, I could lose my apartment, my savings, so you're choosing money over family?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, standing in her pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, surrounded by all the material success that David's engineering job had provided them, I realized my daughter saw me not as a person with legitimate concerns, but as an obstacle to what she wanted. "That's not fair, Sarah." "Fair?" Her laugh was bitter, harsh in a way I'd never heard from her before. "You know what's not fair? Having a mother who won't help her own grandson get to college. Do you know how embarrassing this is? I told Tommy his grandmother would help us, and now I have to go back and tell him that his own family won't support his education." I felt tears pricking at my eyes, but I blinked them back. "Sarah, Tommy can get to college without a car. There are buses, there's campus housing. He shouldn't have to live like that when his grandmother could help, but chooses not to." The words hung in the air between us like poison. I picked up my purse, my hands still trembling, and slung it over my shoulder. The leather was worn and cracked. I'd had it for 10 years, couldn't afford to replace it on my budget, or so she thought. "I think I should go." "Yeah, maybe you should. And maybe you shouldn't come back until you're ready to act like a real grandmother." I walked to the front door, past the family photos lining the hallway, pictures of birthdays, graduations, holidays where I was always there, always smiling, always supporting, pictures of Tommy's first steps, his first day of school, his baseball games. In every single photo, I was there, present, loving, supportive. At the door, I turned back one last time, hoping to see some flicker of regret in her eyes, some sign that she realized how cruel she was being. "I love you, Sarah. I hope someday you'll understand." She didn't respond. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching me leave like I was some unwelcome salesperson who'd overstayed their welcome. As I drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the park where I'd pushed Tommy on swings for hours, past the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated every good report card, I couldn't have imagined that this was just the beginning of a lesson that would change everything. What would you do in my place? Would you risk everything for family, or stand your ground when you know you're right? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below. The silence in my apartment was deafening. 3 days had passed since that awful confrontation, and my phone hadn't rung once. Not a call, not a text, not even one of those silly cat memes Tommy used to send me every morning before school. The absence of those little digital hugs felt like a physical ache in my chest. I kept myself busy the way I always did when life got overwhelming. I organized my closet, folding and refolding the same sweaters I'd owned for years. I rearranged my small living room, moving the worn armchair from one corner to another, then back again. I made enough vegetable soup to feed a small army, old habits from my teaching days when cooking was how I showed love to everyone around me. The soup sat in containers in my refrigerator, growing cold and untouched. Food doesn't taste the same when you're eating it alone, when there's no one to share it with, no one to tell you it's delicious, even when you know you added too much salt. But every time I looked at my phone, hoping for some sign that Sarah had come to her senses, I was met with nothing but my own reflection in the black screen. The woman looking back at me seemed older somehow, more fragile. When had those lines around my eyes gotten so deep? When had my hair gotten so gray? The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the doubt creeping in like water through a cracked foundation. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe a real grandmother would have found a way to help, would have figured out how to make it work. Maybe I was just a bitter old woman clinging to her pennies while her grandson's future hung in the balance. The thoughts circled in my mind like vultures, picking at my confidence, my sense of right and wrong. I'd raised Sarah to be independent, to think for herself, to make good decisions. But somewhere along the way, had I failed her? Had I taught her that love was conditional, that family only mattered when it was convenient? I called my sister Margaret in Florida, needing someone to remind me I wasn't crazy. Margaret had always been the practical one, the sister who spoke her mind whether you wanted to hear it or not. "Honey," she said in that no-nonsense voice that had gotten us both through childhood, through our parents' divorce, through the lean years when we were both struggling single mothers, "you did the right thing. Sarah's 35 years old. If she can't figure out how to get her son a car without putting her elderly mother's financial security at risk, that's her problem, not yours. But Margaret, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just being stubborn? Listen to me, Maggie." She only called me by my childhood nickname when she was being serious. "You remember what happened to Aunt Helen, don't you? She co-signed for Cousin Jimmy's mortgage, and when he lost his job and couldn't make the payments, she lost her house. She spent her last 10 years living in that awful nursing home because she couldn't afford anything better." I did remember. Aunt Helen had been so proud of her little house, the garden she'd tended for 40 years. Losing it had broken something inside her that never healed. But Margaret's words, sensible as they were, couldn't fill the hole in my chest where my family used to be. On Friday evening, I was watching the local news when a story came on about elderly financial abuse. The reporter, a young woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and a professional smile, was interviewing a 72-year-old man who'd lost his home after co-signing a loan for his son's business. The man's face was etched with regret and exhaustion as he explained how he was now living in a one-room efficiency apartment, surviving on food stamps and the kindness of neighbors. His hands shook as he spoke, and I could see the shame in his eyes. "I just wanted to help my boy," he said, his voice breaking. He said it was a sure thing, that the business would take off and he'd pay everything back within a year. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought my own son would let me lose everything. The camera panned to show his tiny apartment, smaller than my own, with a hot plate for cooking and a mattress on the floor. This man, who had probably worked his whole life, who had raised children and paid taxes and been a contributing member of society, was now living like this because he couldn't say no to family. I turned off the TV and sat in the growing darkness of my living room, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time since Tuesday, I wasn't questioning my decision. I was questioning how I'd raised a daughter who could throw away 35 years of love over money. But I had no idea that Sarah was about to learn a lesson that would change both our lives forever. By Sunday, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to sit in my apartment feeling sorry for myself, waiting for a phone call that might never come. If Sarah wanted to cut me out of her life over this, then maybe it was time I started living for myself instead of always being available for everyone else's needs. I'd been thinking about something I'd put off for years, something that had nothing to do with being a mother or grandmother, and everything to do with being Margaret Eleanor Thompson, the woman I was before I became defined by my relationships to other people. The idea had been growing in my mind since that awful confrontation in Sarah's kitchen. All these years, I'd lived quietly, modestly, letting everyone assume they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. I'd played the role of the struggling widow, the grandmother grateful for whatever scraps of attention her family threw her way. But maybe it was time to stop playing that role. Monday morning, I put on my best navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to Tommy's high school graduation, the one that made me feel dignified and strong. I did my hair carefully, applied lipstick for the first time in weeks, and drove downtown to the offices of Henderson and Associates. The building was one of those sleek glass towers that had sprung up in our city's revitalized downtown over the past decade. All modern lines and reflective surfaces that made me feel both intimidated and determined. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "I'd like to speak with someone about estate planning," I told the receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes who reminded me of my former students. She had that same eager-to-please expression I'd seen on countless faces over my 30 years in the classroom. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson, Margaret Thompson." What Sarah didn't know What I'd never told anyone except my lawyer and my sister Margaret was that I wasn't just some old woman living on Social Security and a teacher's pension. My late husband, Robert, had been more than just a good man who loved me for 42 years. He'd been smart with money, incredibly smart. While other couples were buying bigger houses and fancier cars, Robert was quietly investing, saving, planning for our future. When he passed 5 years ago, after a brief but brutal battle with cancer, he'd left me more comfortable than anyone realized, not wealthy exactly, but secure in a way that most people my age could only dream of. I'd lived modestly since then, not out of necessity, but out of choice. I'd wanted to see how my family treated me when they thought I had nothing extra to give. I'd wanted to know if their love was conditional on what I could provide, if I was valued for who I was or what I could do for them. Now I had my answer, and it wasn't the answer I'd hoped for. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson himself, was a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive suits. He listened carefully as I explained what I wanted to do, his eyebrows raising slightly when I showed him my financial statements. But he maintained his professional composure, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. "Mrs. Thompson, are you sure about this? These are significant changes to your estate plan. Have you discussed this with your family?" I thought about Sarah's words. Maybe you shouldn't come back until you're ready to act like a real grandmother. I thought about the way she'd looked at me in her kitchen, like I was some kind of burden she'd been carrying out of obligation. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As I signed the papers, my hand steady, despite the magnitude of what I was doing, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power, control over my own destiny. For too long, I'd let other people define my worth, let them make assumptions about who I was and what I deserved. She was about to find out exactly what kind of grandmother I really was. What would you do if your family took you for granted? Sometimes the people we love most need to learn our worth the hard way. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for the next chapter. The next few days passed in a strange kind of peace. I went about my routine, morning walks around the neighborhood where I'd lived for 15 years, afternoon tea while reading mystery novels that transported me to places where justice always prevailed, evening phone calls with Margaret where we talked about everything except the elephant in the room. But there was something different about me now, something lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was there. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring, wasn't organizing my schedule around other people's needs, wasn't constantly wondering if I was doing enough, giving enough, being enough. I was just being Margaret, and that felt revolutionary. On Thursday morning, I was watering the small herb garden on my apartment balcony, basil and rosemary and thyme that I grew in recycled yogurt containers, when I noticed a familiar car pull into the parking lot below. It was Sarah's silver Honda Accord, the one I'd helped her research and negotiate for 3 years ago, when her old car finally gave up after 200,000 miles. My heart did a little skip, that involuntary flutter of hope that maybe she'd come to apologize. Maybe we could work this out, like adults, like the family I'd thought we were. Maybe she'd realized that throwing away 35 years of love over a car loan was insane. But as I watched from my third-floor perch, I saw her get out of the car with Tommy. They weren't coming to my door. Instead, they walked toward the building next to mine, where my neighbor Mrs. Chen lived. I watched, confused and increasingly concerned, as they knocked on her door and were let inside. Mrs. Chen was a sweet woman in her 70s, a retired nurse who'd moved here from California to be closer to her own grandchildren. We'd become friendly over the years, sharing gardening tips and occasionally having tea together on Sunday afternoons. But why would Sarah be visiting her? 20 minutes later, they emerged, and I could see Sarah's face, even from my third-floor balcony. She looked different, pale, shaken. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Tommy was holding her arm, guiding her back to the car like she might fall down, his young face creased with worry. I'd seen that expression on Sarah's face only once before, when she was 16 and had been caught shoplifting makeup from the drugstore. The shame, the realization that actions have consequences, the dawning understanding that the world wasn't going to bend to accommodate her wants and needs. My phone rang an hour later. It was Mrs. Chen, her voice careful and concerned. "Margaret, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling. Your daughter and grandson just left here, and I think there's something you should know." Mrs. Chen, it turned out, had been more observant than I'd given her credit for. She'd seen the lawyer's car in the parking lot on Monday. Mr. Henderson drove a distinctive black Mercedes that stood out in our modest neighborhood like a diamond in a coal bin. She'd noticed me dressed up, looking more purposeful than I had in months. When Sarah came asking questions about whether I'd been acting strange lately, whether I'd had any visitors, whether I seemed different somehow, Mrs. Chen had put two and two together. I didn't tell her anything specific, dear, but I could see in her face that she realized something was happening, something she didn't know about. She kept asking if you seemed worried about money, if you'd mentioned any financial problems. When I told her you seemed happier lately, more at peace, she got very quiet. After I hung up, I sat on my small couch, looking around my modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and discount store decorations. Sarah had always assumed this was all I had, all I could afford. She'd never asked about my finances, never wondered why I never seemed stressed about money despite living on what she assumed was a fixed income. She'd made assumptions based on appearances, and now those assumptions were cracking like ice in spring. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Tommy. "Grandma, can we talk, please? I think there's been a misunderstanding." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to rush over there and fix whatever was broken between us. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since Monday, knew that some lessons couldn't be learned if the consequences were removed too quickly. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart, but some conversations are better had in person, and some truths are better learned slowly." As I hit send, I realized that the real lesson was just beginning, and for the first time in this whole mess, I wasn't the one who was going to be learning it. Vou expandir apenas os capítulos 6 ao 9, adicionando aproximadamente 2.000 caracteres extras em cada 3 weeks had passed since my visit to Henderson and Associates, and I was beginning to think Sarah had decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe she'd convinced herself that whatever Mrs. Chen had hinted at wasn't important. Maybe she was too proud to dig deeper into her assumptions about her poor, struggling mother. But I should have known my daughter better than that. Sarah had always been persistent when something didn't add up, even as a child. She was the kid who would take apart her toys to see how they worked, who would ask why until I ran out of answers. When she was 12, she'd spent an entire summer investigating why our neighbor's cat always disappeared on Tuesday nights, eventually discovering that Mrs. Rodriguez was secretly taking him to visit her elderly mother at the nursing home. The weather had turned colder, that sharp November chill that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. I'd been watching the maintenance crew winterize the courtyard, covering the flower beds with mulch and draining the decorative fountain. There's something melancholy about preparing for winter, about accepting that beauty must be protected by being hidden away. On a crisp October morning, I was enjoying my coffee and watching the maintenance crew rake leaves in the courtyard when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that didn't belong to any of my elderly neighbors. These weren't the careful, measured steps of someone worried about falling, but the confident stride of someone who owned whatever space they occupied. Then came the knock, not the tentative tap of someone unsure of their welcome, but the firm, authoritative knock of someone who meant business, the kind of knock that said, "I know you're in there, and I'm not going away." I set down my coffee mug. Ironically, it was the world's best mom mug that Sarah had given me for Mother's Day 5 years ago, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I could see a man in an expensive charcoal gray suit holding a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I opened the door to find him wearing the kind of confident smile that meant trouble. He was probably in his 40s, with perfectly styled hair and shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything about him screamed expensive, from his silk tie to his gold watch, to the way he held himself like someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mrs. Thompson, my name is James Mitchell. I'm a private investigator hired by your daughter, Sarah Henderson. May I come in?" My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. A private investigator. Sarah had actually hired a private investigator to spy on her own mother. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but also revealing in ways I don't think she'd intended. "What does Sarah need a private investigator for?" "She's concerned about your welfare, ma'am. She's worried that someone might be taking advantage of you financially. There have been some irregularities that have come to her attention. May I come in so we can discuss this privately?" I stepped aside and let him enter, my mind racing. Sarah had hired a private investigator. She'd gone that far, spent that kind of money, and private investigators weren't cheap, because she couldn't accept that her assumptions about me might be wrong, because she couldn't imagine that her mother might have a life, might have resources, might have made decisions that didn't revolve around her daughter's needs and expectations. Mr. Mitchell sat on my worn couch and opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. The leather was butter soft, the kind that only comes with age and quality. He pulled out a manila folder thick with papers and photographs, setting them on my coffee table like evidence in a trial. "Mrs. Thompson, your daughter is concerned because she's discovered some discrepancies in what she thought she knew about your financial situation. She's worried that someone might be scamming you, or that you might be making poor financial decisions due to your age." The condescension in his voice made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. He was treating me like I was some confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs, like the mere fact of being 67 years old made me incompetent by default. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Well, for instance, she knows you've been meeting with lawyers, making changes to legal documents. She's seen expensive cars in your parking lot, cars that don't belong to any of your neighbors. She's concerned that someone might be manipulating you into changing your will or giving away your money to strangers." I almost laughed. Sarah thought someone was scamming me because she couldn't imagine that I might have money of my own, that I might be capable of making my own financial decisions. The idea that her mother might be wealthy, might be in control of her own destiny, was so foreign to her worldview that the only explanation she could accept was fraud. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate Sarah's concern, but I assure you, no one is taking advantage of me. I'm making my own decisions with full mental capacity and complete understanding of the consequences." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious, more intense. "Mrs. Thompson, I've done some preliminary research into your finances. You have significantly more assets than your daughter realized, substantially more. She's worried that you're being targeted because of your wealth, that someone has identified you as a vulnerable target." There it was. He'd found out about Robert's investments, about the life insurance policies, about the careful financial planning that had left me comfortable instead of struggling. Sarah now knew that her poor, desperate mother was actually quite well off. The mother she'd thrown out of her life for refusing to co-sign a loan was sitting on assets that could have covered that car payment without even making a dent in her financial security. And what exactly does Sarah want you to do about it? She wants to make sure you're protected. She's prepared to take legal action, if necessary, to prevent anyone from taking advantage of you. She's looking into options for financial guardianship, ways to ensure that your assets are protected from predators. The irony was breathtaking. Sarah, who had thrown me out of her life because I wouldn't co-sign a loan, was now worried about protecting my money, not because she cared about my well-being, but because she'd realized there was more at stake than she'd thought. She wasn't concerned about my happiness or my autonomy. She was concerned about assets that she'd apparently decided needed her protection. "Mr. Mitchell, please tell my daughter that I appreciate her concern, but it's misplaced. I'm in full control of my faculties and my finances. I have excellent legal representation, and I'm making informed decisions about my own life. And please tell her that if she wants to know about my financial situation, she can ask me directly, instead of hiring strangers to investigate her own mother." He looked uncomfortable for the first time since he'd arrived, shifting in his seat and avoiding my eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, she did try to reach out to you. She's called several times, but you haven't returned her calls." I walked to my kitchen counter and picked up my phone, scrolling through the call log with deliberate slowness. There they were, 7 missed calls from Sarah over the past week. Calls I'd seen and deliberately ignored. Calls that had come at all hours of the day and night, like she was some kind of emergency that couldn't wait. "Mr. Mitchell, 3 weeks ago, my daughter told me not to come back until I was ready to act like a real grandmother. She threw me out of her life because I wouldn't put my financial security at risk for her convenience. Now that she's discovered I have money, suddenly she's concerned about my welfare? Suddenly, I need protection?" His professional composure cracked slightly, and I could see him reassessing the situation, realizing that maybe he hadn't gotten the whole story from his client. "Mrs. Thompson, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all. Please tell Sarah that when she's ready to apologize for how she treated me, when she's ready to have an honest conversation about respect and family, she knows where to find me. But I won't be manipulated or investigated like some kind of criminal just because she's discovered that her assumptions about me were wrong. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling a mixture of sadness and vindication. Sarah had learned the truth, but not the lesson. She still didn't understand that the money wasn't the point. The disrespect was. She still saw me as someone who needed to be managed, controlled, protected from my own decisions. But she was about to get an education in consequences that no private investigator could have prepared her for. What would you do if your family hired someone to investigate you instead of just talking to you? Sometimes the truth hurts more than the lies we tell ourselves. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The phone calls started the next day, not just from Sarah, but from David, from Tommy, even from Sarah's best friend Jennifer, who I'd known since the girls were in high school together. Everyone suddenly wanted to talk to me, to check in and see how I was doing. It was fascinating, really, how quickly the narrative had changed. 3 weeks ago, I was the selfish grandmother who wouldn't help her family. Now I was the vulnerable elderly woman who needed protection from financial predators. The only thing that had changed was their knowledge of my bank account. The calls followed a pattern. First, casual conversation about the weather, about how I was feeling, about whether I needed anything. Then, carefully worded questions about my recent activities, about whether anyone had been pressuring me to make financial decisions, about whether I felt confused or overwhelmed by anything. They were fishing, all of them, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't, trying to understand how they'd gotten everything so wrong. David called on Tuesday evening, his voice careful and apologetic. "Mom, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry about how everything happened. Sarah's been, she's been struggling with some things, and I think she took her stress out on you unfairly." "What kind of things, David?" There was a long pause. "Financial things, work things. We've been having some problems that we didn't want to burden you with, and I think Sarah felt like she was drowning, and you were the only lifeline she could see." It was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in months. David had always been straightforward, but even he had been part of the deception, part of the assumption that I was too fragile or too poor to handle the truth about their struggles. "David, if you and Sarah had been honest with me from the beginning, if you told me you were having financial difficulties instead of just demanding that I cosign a loan, things might have been different. I know that now. But Mom, Sarah's scared. She's scared that she's ruined everything between you two, and she's scared that someone might be taking advantage of you, and she doesn't know how to fix any of it." I answered Tommy's call on Thursday evening. My grandson's voice was shaky, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. Tommy had always been confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance, secure in his place as the beloved only grandchild who could do no wrong. "Grandma? It's me. I wanted to apologize for everything. I didn't know. I mean, Mom never told me exactly what happened between you two, but I'm starting to figure it out." "What are you figuring out, sweetheart?" "That we treated you badly, that we took you for granted, that we only cared about what you could do for us, not about who you are." His voice cracked slightly. "I keep thinking about all the times you came to my games, all the times you helped me with homework, all the birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and I realize that I never once asked you what you wanted or how you were doing. I just expected you to be there, expected you to say yes to everything, expected you to make my life easier without ever thinking about your life at all." His words hit me harder than I'd expected. This was my grandson, the boy I'd raised as much as his parents had, the child who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him stories about brave knights and clever princesses. "Tommy, you're not responsible for your mother's choices, but I am responsible for mine. I should have stood up for you. When she was treating you like that, I should have said something. I was just so focused on getting that car, on making college easier for myself, that I didn't think about what it would cost you. Not just the money, but the respect, the dignity, the relationship." I closed my eyes, feeling tears threaten for the first time in weeks. "Tommy, you're 18 years old. You're not supposed to have to manage your mother's emotions or protect your grandmother from your own family. Yeah, but I should have been grateful for everything you did for me, instead of just expecting more. And Grandma, I don't need the car. I can take the bus to college. I can get a job on campus. I can figure it out. I don't need anything that would hurt you or make you feel like we only love you for what you can give us." That's when I started crying. Not from sadness, but from relief. At least one person in my family understood what this was really about. "I love you, Tommy. More than you'll ever know. I love you too, Grandma. And I'm going to make this right somehow. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make sure Mom understands what she did, what we all did." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, thinking about the conversation I knew was coming. Sarah would want to talk eventually, would want to explain herself, would want to fix things now that she knew there was money involved. But I'd learned something important over these past weeks. I'd learned that I didn't have to accept apologies that weren't real, didn't have to pretend that everything was fine just to keep the peace. I'd spent too many years being the accommodating one, the understanding one, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made everyone else comfortable. Maybe it was time for other people to be uncomfortable for a while. The next morning, I was surprised to find Mrs. Chen knocking on my door, carrying a plate of her famous almond cookies and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Mrs. Chen was usually the picture of calm dignity, so seeing her practically vibrating with energy was both amusing and concerning. "Margaret, dear, you have to hear what happened yesterday. Your daughter came to see me again, and this time she brought her husband. I invited her in and made tea while she told me about Sarah and David's visit. Apparently, they'd come to ask more questions about my unusual behavior, but Mrs. Chen had decided she'd had enough of their fishing expedition. I told them exactly what I thought of children who hire investigators to spy on their own parents instead of just picking up the phone and having an honest conversation. I told them that in my culture, we respect our elders. We don't treat them like criminals just because we don't understand their choices." Mrs. Chen was normally the most diplomatic person I knew, someone who could navigate any social situation with grace and tact. So hearing about her giving Sarah and David a piece of her mind was both shocking and deeply satisfying. What did they say? The husband looked embarrassed, kept trying to apologize and explain. He seems like a good man who knows his wife made a mistake. But your daughter, she got defensive. Started talking about how worried she was, how she was just trying to protect you. I told her that if she was really worried about protecting you, maybe she shouldn't have thrown you out of her house in the first place. I nearly choked on my tea. "You didn't. I certainly did." And then I told her that respect isn't something you can turn on and off like a faucet. You can't treat someone terribly and then expect them to trust you just because you've decided you need something from them. I told her that in China, children who treat their parents the way she treated you would be shunned by their community. As Mrs. Chen left, pressing the plate of cookies into my hands and patting my shoulder like a proud mother, I realized that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Sometimes the family you choose is more loyal than the family you're born with, but the real reckoning was still coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally came on a gray Saturday morning in November. I was reading in my armchair, wrapped in the quilt Robert's mother had made for us as a wedding gift, when I heard familiar voices in the hallway outside my apartment. Sarah and David were arguing in hushed tones, their voices carrying through the thin walls. I could hear the tension, the frustration, the fear that had been building between them for weeks. "Just knock on the door, Sarah. This is ridiculous. You don't understand. She's different now. She's not the same person. She used to always answer my calls, always want to see me. Now it's like she doesn't care if we exist. She's your mother. She raised you. She deserves better than this, and you know it. I know, okay? I know I messed up, but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what to say to her. How about I'm sorry? How about I was wrong? How about treating her like a human being instead of like some kind of problem to be solved?" I'd always liked David. He was a good man, steady and kind, the type of person who thought before he spoke and meant what he said. I could hear in his voice that he was ashamed of how this whole situation had unfolded, that he'd been trying to talk sense into Sarah for weeks. But Sarah sounded scared, and that was something I'd never heard from my confident, take-charge daughter. She'd always been the one with the plan, the one who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. Hearing her sound lost and uncertain was almost as shocking as everything else that had happened. When the knock finally came, I took my time answering it. Let them wait. Let them wonder if I was even home, if I would even speak to them. Let them experience just a fraction of the uncertainty I'd been living with for weeks. Sarah looked terrible. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing an old sweater I recognized from her college days. David stood behind her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mom? Can we come in, please?" I stepped aside without speaking, letting them enter my small living room. They sat on my couch like strangers, perched on the edge of the cushions, as if they might need to run at any moment. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. "Mom, we need to talk. About everything. About what happened. About the things I said. About—" She gestured helplessly around my apartment. "About all of this." "What about it, Sarah?" "I know about the money. About Dad's investments. About the life insurance. About everything. I know you're not struggling financially. I know you could have helped us without any risk to yourself." I waited. This was her show now. I wanted to see how she would handle it, whether she would take responsibility or find new ways to make this my fault. "I don't understand why you didn't tell me. Why you let me think you were barely getting by. Why you let me worry about you living in this tiny apartment, eating generic food, wearing old clothes. Did you worry, Sarah? Or did you just assume?" She flinched like I'd slapped her. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if people knew you had money, they might try to take advantage of you." "People like your own daughter, you mean?" The words hung in the air between us like a blade. David shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah's face crumpled. "That's not—" "I wasn't trying to take advantage of you. I just needed help, and I thought family was supposed to help each other." "Family is supposed to help each other, Sarah, but help goes both ways. It's built on respect and love, not demands and ultimatums. I know I handled it badly. I know I said things I shouldn't have said. But Mom, I was desperate. Tommy's college expenses, the mortgage, David's job situation." She looked at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. "We're not doing as well as we pretended to be. We're struggling, and I thought you were struggling too, and I panicked. For the first time in this whole mess, Sarah was being honest. Not manipulative, not demanding, just honest about her fears and her mistakes. I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the admission that the perfect life she'd been projecting was just a facade. "Sarah, if you had come to me and explained your situation honestly, if you had asked for help instead of demanding it, if you had treated me like a person instead of like an ATM, things might have been different. I know that now. But Mom, I still don't understand why you hid the money from us, why you let us think you were poor, why you pretended to struggle when you didn't have to." I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized she still didn't get it. She still thought this was about money, about deception, about some kind of test I'd put her through. Because I wanted to know if you loved me for who I am, or for what I could give you. I wanted to know if I mattered to you beyond my usefulness. And Sarah, I got my answer. She started crying then, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "I do love you, Mom. I love you so much. I was scared and stressed, and I took it out on you because I knew you'd always forgive me. I knew you'd always be there. But I won't always be there, Sarah. I'm 67 years old. I don't have forever to wait for you to figure out how to treat me with respect." David finally spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Thompson, Sarah's been miserable since this happened. She knows she was wrong. We both know she was wrong. Is there any way we can fix this?" I looked at them both. These people I'd loved and supported and worried about for decades, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. The money isn't the issue. It never was. The issue is that you threw away 35 years of love over a car loan. You told me not to come back until I was ready to act like a real grandmother, and then you hired a private investigator to spy on me when you found out I had assets worth protecting." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "If we're going to fix this, it has to be because you genuinely understand what you did wrong, not because you found out I'm not poor. Can you do that?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I can do that. I want to do that. Then we can start over." "But Sarah, things are going to be different now. I'm not going to be available whenever you need me just because it's convenient. I'm not going to pretend to be poor to make you feel better about your choices. And I'm not going to accept being treated badly just to keep the peace." She nodded again, And for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the daughter I'd raised, the one who could admit when she was wrong, who could learn from her mistakes. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you too, Sarah. But love isn't enough. We need respect too. What would you do if your family finally apologized, but you weren't sure if they meant it? Sometimes forgiveness is a process, not a moment. Like and subscribe to see how this story ends. 6 months have passed since that tearful conversation in my living room, and I'm sitting here now, watching the spring rain streak down my windows, thinking about how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. The seasons have turned full circle since this whole ordeal began. The trees that were golden with autumn leaves when Sarah first asked me to co-sign that loan are now green with new growth, heavy with the promise of summer. There's something poetic about that, about how life continues its cycles regardless of our human dramas, how nature heals and renews itself even when we think our wounds are permanent. Sarah and I talk regularly now, but it's different. Better, I think, though it took time to find our new rhythm. She doesn't call me expecting immediate solutions to her problems, and I don't drop everything to rush to her rescue. We've learned to have conversations instead of emergencies, discussions instead of demands. The change didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. About 2 months after our reconciliation, Sarah called me in tears because Tommy had gotten into a minor car accident. Nothing serious, just a fender bender in a parking lot. Her first instinct was to call me expecting me to drop everything and rush over to handle the situation. When I calmly asked what she needed from me and suggested she handle it herself, there was a moment of silence that felt like a test. "You're right," she said finally. "I can handle this. I guess I'm still learning how to be independent." It was a small moment, but it felt like a victory for both of us. Tommy got his car eventually, a reliable used Honda that he bought himself with money from his part-time job and a small loan that he qualified for on his own. He was so proud when he drove it over to show me, beaming like he'd conquered the world. "Look, Grandma, I did it myself." And he had. The boy I'd worried was becoming entitled had turned into a young man who understood the value of earning what he wanted. He'd also learned something about family relationships that I wished I'd been able to teach him under better circumstances. "Grandma," he told me one afternoon as we sat on my new front porch, "I never realized how much you did for us until you stopped doing it. I never thought about how much work it was for you to always be available, always be helpful. I just thought that's what grandmothers did." "What do you think grandmothers should do?" I asked him. "Love their grandchildren, be there when they really need you, but not be taken for granted, not be treated like they don't have their own lives and feelings." Sarah's financial situation improved too, though not in the way she'd expected. David got a promotion at work, and they made some difficult but necessary changes to their lifestyle. They downsized their house, trading the colonial with the white picket fence for a smaller ranch-style home that better fit their actual budget. They traded in their expensive cars for more practical ones and learned to live within their means instead of constantly reaching for more. But more importantly, they learned to be honest about their struggles instead of pretending everything was perfect. Sarah started seeing a therapist to work through her anxiety about money and her tendency to lash out when she felt cornered. David joined a support group for people dealing with financial stress. They were building a more authentic life, one based on reality instead of appearances. The biggest change, though, has been in me. I moved out of my small apartment last month, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I found a lovely little house in a neighborhood across town with a real garden and a front porch where I can sit and watch the world go by. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, chosen by me for me, not based on what other people expected or assumed about my circumstances. The house has 2 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen with windows that look out onto the garden, and a living room with built-in bookshelves that I've filled with mysteries and biographies and poetry collections. There's a small study where I can pay bills and manage my investments, and a guest room for when Tommy comes to visit during college breaks. I've also started volunteering at the Literacy Center downtown, teaching adults to read. It turns out that retirement from teaching doesn't mean retirement from making a difference. These students, mostly immigrants and people who fell through the cracks of the education system, remind me every day that it's never too late to learn, never too late to grow, never too late to become who you're meant to be. One of my students, Maria, is a 45-year-old woman from Guatemala who cleans offices at night and comes to our classes during the day. She's learning to read so she can help her children with their homework, so she can read the letters they bring home from school, so she can be the mother she wants to be. Her determination reminds me that strength comes in many forms, that dignity isn't about what you have, but about how you carry yourself through life's challenges. Mrs. Chen visits me in my new house every Sunday. We sit on my front porch, drinking tea and sharing gossip about our old apartment building. She's become more than a neighbor. She's become the sister I chose, the family member who saw my worth even when my blood relatives couldn't. You know, she told me last week, I always knew you were stronger than you let people believe. But I don't think even you knew how strong you really were. Sarah comes by too, usually on Saturday afternoons. She helps me with my garden, and we talk about everything and nothing while we plant tomatoes and pull weeds. Last week, she brought me a small ceramic plaque for my garden that reads, "Bloom where you're planted." When I raised my eyebrows at the sentiment, she laughed and said, "I know it's cheesy, Mom, but I thought about you when I saw it. You bloomed even when we tried to keep you in the dark." It was the first time she'd acknowledged, really acknowledged, what she'd put me through. Not just the fight about the loan, but years of taking me for granted, of assuming I existed primarily to serve their needs. The money, Robert's careful investments and insurance policies, sits quietly in my accounts, growing steadily. I've made some changes to my will, establishing a scholarship fund for students like Tommy who need help with college expenses, and setting aside money for causes I care about. The Literacy Center will receive a significant donation, as will the local senior center, and a fund that helps elderly people avoid financial abuse. Sarah and Tommy will inherit what's left, but they'll inherit it as a gift, not as an expectation or an entitlement. And more importantly, they'll inherit it knowing that I lived my own life first, that I made my own choices, that I was more than just a source of support for their dreams. I think about Robert sometimes, wondering what he'd make of all this drama. He always said I was stronger than I gave myself credit for, that I let people walk all over me because I confused kindness with weakness. "Maggie," he used to say, "you can love someone and still expect them to treat you right. You can be generous and still have boundaries. You can put family first without putting yourself last." It took me 67 years and a fight over a car loan to really understand what he meant. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this wasn't about money or family dynamics or standing up for myself. It was about the difference between being needed and being valued. For years, I thought being needed was enough. I thought that as long as my family required my help, my presence, my support, that meant I mattered to them. But being needed isn't the same as being respected. Being useful isn't the same as being loved. And sometimes, the people who claim to love you most are the ones who take your love most for granted. I'm not angry anymore. Anger was exhausting, and I'm too old to waste energy on emotions that don't serve me. Instead, I'm grateful. Grateful for the lesson. Grateful for the chance to redefine my relationships on my own terms. Grateful for the opportunity to discover who Margaret Thompson really is when she's not constantly trying to be who everyone else needs her to be. My phone is ringing now. It's Tommy, calling to tell me about his latest college adventures. His voice is bright with excitement as he describes his classes, his friends, his plans for the future. He calls me every week, not because he needs something, but because he wants to share his life with me. "I love you, Grandma," he says before we hang up, and I know he means it. Not because of what I can do for him, but because of who I am. And that, I've learned, makes all the difference in the world. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to learn how to treat you better. Sometimes love means setting boundaries. And sometimes the family that truly values you is the one that emerges after you stop accepting less than you deserve. The rain has stopped now, and the sun is breaking through the clouds, casting everything in golden light. In my garden, the flowers I planted last month are beginning to bloom. Bright red tulips and yellow daffodils that will bring color to the world for weeks to come. I think I'll make some tea and sit on my porch for a while, watching the world wake up from winter's sleep. There's something beautiful about new beginnings, about second chances, about the courage it takes to start over at any age. The end.